All right, good day, everyone. Happy Monday. Gonna continue studying for comps today. Today I will be doing an IR video, so I'll be talking about the question is actually an interesting one. Is realism constrained by its origins as a theory? And I will argue yes, it is, because IR was primarily conceived right after major international conflicts, which gives it an orientation to a strong bias towards military power and power. Let's call it measures of military power, and away from other insights like normative insights. So I've already actually done all the sketching of my sources because it makes the video somewhat pedantic to have me just write for the first bit of them. So today we're going to be using William C. Woolforth. Anyway, I assure you it was done from memory. It took me about a minute and a half. So William C. Woolforth, his chapter on realism in the Oxford Handbook of International Relations, E.H. Carr's 20 Years Crisis, Hans Morgenthau's The Political Science of E.H. Carr, Hans Morgenthau, Politics Among Nations, Kenneth Walsh's Theory of International Politics. I'll also be mentioning Man, the State, and War. John Lewis Gaddis, IR and the IR Theory in the End of the Cold War. And finally, N.R. Smith, Can Neoclassical Realism Become a Genuine Theory of International Relations? Quite the mouthful. You'll hear my cat. He's an asshole. When he hears me making a video, he immediately starts making noise. So, okay. So it was a somewhat convoluted thesis statement. It makes more sense when I write it down. But point being that IR tended to be conceived, during right after, or actually in case of H. Carr, leading up to a major world war, and it kind of blinded a lot of the theorists to factors besides military power. I'm actually going to look at some of the founders. So the first part, I'm going to talk about some of the founders of international relations. So I'll talk specifically about E.H. Carr and Hans Morgenthau, and then I'll look at how that kind of bias towards military force and kind of abstract notions and of balancing affected later theorists. Ooh, actually, John Mearsheimer, Back to the Future. I'm going to mention him. My computer is also a dick, by the way, because anytime it hears me making a video, it immediately starts making lots of noise. If I check Windows, I'm sure it's doing a bunch of unnecessary background tasks. Anyway, I'll talk about some later generations and how that kind of, those blinders that were conceived in the 30s and 40s sort of stayed on for later iterations, and actually probably got worse. Then later I'll talk about sort of Gaddis's critique, and then I'll look into N.R. Smith stuff, talking about the way ahead for realism, which is neoclassical realism. So lots of theory. It's not fun, but let's get started. So William C. Woolforth, in his article on, his book chapter on realism in the Oxford Handbook, he says that realism is actually a fairly diverse body of theory, a diverse school, but it's governed by four key characteristics, all schools of realism. One is that they all have a presumption of egoism. So humans kind of every man for himself. Two, groupism. Everyone kind of people are naturally a bit tribal and tend to act in a tribal way, whether that's, in this case through a state, right? Three, presumption of anarchy. So there is no, kind of Hobbesian state of war. There is no overarching international authority. Any kind of international authority is merely a reflection of agreements among states living in anarchy. So what does that mean, right? So they'll say, okay, well, we have United Nations. It's, it's an international body, to which realists would say, yeah, but it's only really an international body so much as the member states want it to be, which is true. There are 5 nations that basically can say, yeah, we veto anything. And in fact, I mean, the UN's only really done collective security once, and that was Korea. And I mean, that was basically a U.S. operation with the UN flag, and the Russians had walked out in protest. It's quite the story. And the fourth element is power politics. States are very interested in power politics, which is about managing power internationally, whether that's through the balance of power or balancing or offensive and defensive realism. So let's talk about E.H. Carr. So before we talk about E.H. Carr, I'll just mention a bit of historical background. There's something to be said that all of the theorists come out of a period of international crisis, or at least the foundational schools. So, for example, if you go back before IR became a formal field, often Thucydides is listed as a sort of a founding father, a papoose of realist theory. I mean, that was just following the Peloponnesian Wars. Athens is occupied. It's really not a great time. You look at Thomas Hobbes coming out of the English Civil War. Machiavelli, he just kind of got kicked out of Florence. But, I mean, it was during the Italian Wars, kind of just medieval, late medieval, early Renaissance kind of, you know what, I'm going to use those historical terms because it's contentious. Anyway, he was coming out of not a great time for Italy. Everyone's fighting amongst themselves. E.H. Carr. So if you look at E.H. Carr, it's the book actually ends up hitting the presses in 1940, which is awkward for a book that advocates appeasement. It's a bit awkward. But basically what E.H. Carr is saying, you know, you look at the First World War, that wasn't a good time, and we haven't really done much since that has prevented us from having further war, because we've ignored power and we've been utopian, is his idea. He's not a fan of Wilson. I'm also not a fan of Wilson. Wilson was a hypocritical racist. So, just anyway. So what is E.H. Carr arguing? E.H. Carr is arguing that ultimately all the theory in the world can't change the facts on the ground. Material factors matter, and what makes any kind of system that might create peace is worth trying. So, for example, right, he's sort of tearing down 19th century liberalism, right? And he's saying if we really want to change, and at least in the 20 Years' Crisis, he's really tearing it down. In some of his further work, like The Conditions of Peace, published in 1942, he's arguing that we need to adopt some kind of state planning to change the material conditions on the ground. If we change the material conditions and everyone's kind of fat and happy, then we can have peace. So he's kind of arguing, he argues that ethics is a function of politics and politics is a function of power. I got a bit off track from 20 Years' Crisis. Another bit about 20 Years' Crisis was the idea of peaceful rise. He was advocating appeasement partially because he was saying, well, listen, the facts on the ground say Germany is a rising power, and whether they're whether they're Nazis or not, we have to accommodate them or go to war. He's right in a sense. Probably good we went to war. Anyway, so Hans Morgenthau in the Political Science of E.H. Carr, he does criticize Carr somewhat for this, right? I mean, he actually argues that Carr is trying to build a new utopia. So even Carr recognizes his kind of negative outlook in the 20, I mean negative as in philosophically negative. He's proving a philosophically negative point in the 20 Years' Crisis. He's kind of saying exactly what we've been doing isn't working. Morgenthau points out that he's actually just advocating for a new kind of utopia, right? Carr starts off as a Hegelian. He ends up as more or less, I don't want to say tanky, but he ends up a pretty hardcore Marxist. So you look at Morgenthau, and you go into Morgenthau Politics Among Nations, and I mean, Morgenthau could be like, you could have a heavy, like, black metal fans, like, or death metal fans. You could definitely have a metal band named after Hans J. Morgenthau. I mean, he kind of fled the Nazis, goes to the U.S. and starts making, kind of really hardcore wars about, or international politics is about power, and states are governed by, like, this kind of negative human nature. Humans are egotistical, groupist. They need to be kept in check. Anyway, so, I mean, Hans Morgenthau has pretty good reason to have a negative view of human nature. And in Politics Among Nations, he's actually pretty explicit in his in the limitations of his theory. So he has a positivist bent, right? Ooh, I have the book, so I'll hold it up. Politics Among Nations by Hans J. Morgenthau, The Struggle for Power and Peace, first published in 1948. What he's arguing is that he has somewhat of a positive point of view, and he's saying just as economists can take economic measures and do a fairly objective look at economic man, we could do the same with power. That's what IR is. It's kind of like economics, but with power, and there are objective laws which govern how states interact. And he's somewhat, and they'll act in the national interest. Now, he's somewhat, Woolforth says that Morgenthau comes the closest to having a kind of coherent theory. The problem with Morgenthau, though, is he doesn't have a good way of defining what the national interest is, right? So if you just kind of assume that humans are shitty and they're competing for power and they're competing for security and they view everyone as a threat and all that kind of noise, I mean, you can make assumptions about what they'll see as their national interest, but we know for a fact that that's just he's doing a direct analogy to economics. Well, we know in economics that people don't actually maximize their utility. People act against their own interest all the time, right? Why does everyone buy fucking lottery tickets? Excuse me. I'm going to be an academic. Why would someone buy a lottery ticket when the math is against them? It's because people don't act always in their own interest. We get to Kenneth Waltz. Kenneth Waltz tries to refine this theory. Now, Kenneth Waltz isn't a product of such negative circumstances, right? That Kenneth, although Waltz actually has to finish up Man the State and War just as he's getting ready to deploy to Korea with the U.S. Army. So he probably has a reasonably negative view of human nature. But with Waltz, he actually tries to take that Morgenthau's idea of you can have objective laws which govern human conflict and we should have a degree of predictability. I mean, Morgenthau throughout the book, he's always saying, don't get this is a way for understanding, and we can make kind of loose predictions, but we shouldn't try to get too detailed. And Kenneth Waltz kind of goes all in. So he starts off with Man, the State, and War, and the whole idea behind that by examining, he bases it off of political philosophy, right? So he gets his idea of levels of the three images from the three levels of analysis that tend to be used in political science, right? So first image is the individual, second image is the state, third image is the system. In Man, the State, and War, he starts arguing for the third image. And he does it fairly eloquently. It's a very good book. I mean, it's his dissertation, which is... I wish I had it. I can only hope my wildest dreams that my dissertation will be as influential as Waltz has. I'm sure pretty much every PhD student says that. Anyway, but he goes really down a rabbit hole. So when he publishes The Theory of International Politics in 1979, he's been influenced by a guy named J. David Singer. And J. David Singer is the guy behind the Correlates of War project, and he's a big quantitative theorist. And by the time we get to Theory of International Politics, they're trying to, I mean, he's taken a couple of assumptions and sort of abstracted them through a process of, he claims it's inductive. I don't fully buy the idea that that's inductive. He's kind of just strung out this theory where it's all about the structure, and if we define the structure precisely, we can kind of define the behavior of states precisely. Now, this leads to discussions of, for example, multipolar and bipolar systems, and mathematically, bipolar systems are more stable because they can do internal balancing. What does that mean? Okay, so, oh dear, I still have my poor rendition of Korea on here. So, what do we mean by internal balancing? So, let's say you have two blocks of countries. And we're doing this totally theoretically, but let's just for the sake, a couple of nonsense names. So we have, over here, we'll have Godless Commies. Just a random nonsense name. And the Godless Commies are brought up among, like, a bunch of nations. And we have, on the other side, we'll have Freedom Land plus Freedom Land Mini. Now, the beauty about a bipolar system is that it's internally balancing. So, let's say our Godless Commies, they start, I don't know, they gain some kind of strategic advantage in that they've increased their military power, right? And they're directing it against a member, you know, we'll just call just a nonsense word, say, West Germany. Just nonsense words. The beauty about this is that if you have that whole system can kind of internally balance in that, you know, say there's a really big country there, and we'll just call it America, just another nonsense word. They can do this internal balancing so that conflict is kind of mediated between the two. Now, where it gets really dangerous is if we have a third party. So this joke about it being nonsense words is kind of wearing thin. So let's say there's a super Yugoslavia. Let's say Yugoslavia happened to be like a big nuclear armed power, and maybe the Italians had joined with them, and they kind of formed this third bloc in the south of Europe. Well, if both these countries are competing, are trying to form alliances with elements of that bloc, because they're afraid. Like that block actually can't really be neutral because both will see it. If they're not, you know, if you're not with me, you're with him, right? We're talking about egoism and groupism. That's where it gets destabilizing. We're going for that third block right there. Okay, so that's what Kenneth Waltz predicts. And the thing is that you know, and like bipolarity is so much better than multipolarity. It doesn't really work out that way, does it? Right? You know, at the end of the Cold War, I mean, in John Lewis Gaddis's article, the theory, international relations theory and the end of the Cold War, and I have a book by him, so I'll hold it up. This is a great little book, by the way. You should pick it up. It's very good. So I should have two books by him. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It doesn't really work out that way, and in fact, it doesn't predict. As John Lewis Gaddis points out, that behavioralist approach actually doesn't predict what happens in Europe. At the end of the Cold War, it's left as a challenge, and a great example of it, of those kind of blinders that were put on initially pretty loosely by Morgenthau, but actually tightened in the years after, is John Mearsheimer's article "Back to the Future: Europe at the End of the Cold War," I think. So he's writing, I think, in 1989, as the wall's starting to come down. He's saying, listen, what's going to govern Europe is going to be the balance of military power. We really have to worry about the balance of military power, and maybe there'll be more nuclear weapons. And at one point, Mearsheimer was like, everyone should just get nukes, because if we all have nukes, then we can all be, like, we better be friendly with each other. And that's really not how it worked out with Europe. You know, realists will look out at, you know, kind of very neorealists, or structural realists is actually a more accurate term. We'll say, oh, well, look at all the problems in Europe, you know, with, for example, like Hungary and Poland, and they'll, you know, and they're kind of turned to the right, and Britain getting out and the Greek crisis. It's like, yeah, but it's still holding together, isn't it? Because last time I checked, the EU is the world's single largest trading bloc. And the U.S. and the Soviet Union were able to withdraw their forces. Yeah, I mean, like, it's, for all of its problems, Europe's actually doing pretty well. And again, they'll point out difficulties like we're having in Ukraine, for example. I would argue Ukraine's actually somewhat localized, and you have to see it in European history. man, Europeans are good at killing each other. Like, amazingly good at killing each other. Like, you only have to see it basically as a person, with your own eyes. Like, you go to the ossuary at Verdun, right? And it's very moving. Geez, I have to check the facts or figures. I think there's something like 130,000 sets of bones there. And this has nothing to do with my comp, so I'm going to fact check that. So according to Wikipedia, through small outside windows, the skeletal remains of at least 130,000 unidentified combatants. So not bad. Although that's morbid, horrifying. Anyway, Europeans are really good at killing each other, and they really haven't done it since we've had the EU. At the end of the Cold War, that kind of balancing military power thing, it hasn't really worked out that way. Even if you're looking at the way the EU governs itself, realists will always kind of expand a bit, right? So, like, for example, Poland has recently had some pressure to change some of its internal policies. Poland actually, I've worked with the Polish army. They're a very professional, very well-equipped army. And the Poles responded to the economic incentives for not leaving the EU pretty well. And in fact, Polish civil society did, right? Everyone covered policy changes in Warszawa. But there were people on the streets in mass numbers. And these were people who were not really used to, who had a half century of non-democracy. I'll put it that way. At least a half century. It didn't really explain it. John Mearsheimer's article fell flat. So where do we go from here? We go to this group of theories called neoclassical realism. So what is neoclassical realism? N.R. Smith in the article, Can Neoclassical Liberalism Become a something school of international relations viable, I think, where he kind of looks at some work that started coming. NCR was first identified by a guy named Gideon Rose in 1998. Anyway, as a blending of changes to traditional, at this point, basically structural realist theory, because they were taking work from the constructivists and saying, well, okay, states will act if they feel threatened, but why do they feel threatened, right? And they feel threatened because there's a social relationship behind that threat, right? So, I mean, who coined that term? Who use this word? Ian Hurd talks about it in his article on his chapter on constructivism in the handbook. Why are 5 North Korean nuclear weapons so much more threatening than 200 British ones? It's actually a great point. Realists will often fall back on this idea of, oh, well, that's just a natural alliance. And it's kind of a cop-out. So the constructivists got a hold of it. NCR starts showing up in the late 1990s. N.R. Smith, actually, Wohlforth describes one of the strongest bits of neoclassical realists as they try to look at smaller problems. They're not trying to build grand theories like Waltz, for example, or Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer is an offensive realist. So he kind of builds a grand theory. NCR tends to look at, they still have presumptions about power and stuff, but they have a wider view, more sources, smaller problems. And I think it's a bit more honest, and they're kind of trying to build a Verhesten, more of a Verhesten view of IR. So, I think N.R. Smith is correct. He identifies actually 3 types of neoclassical realism, which I won't get into. One common bit about all 3 of them, though, is they look more closely at the relationship between internal and external factors, and that's probably the way forward. It's kind of loosening up. It's actually kind of going back to Morgenthau and back to Carr in many ways, of kind of loosening up that theoretical straitjacket. So anyway, there you have it. To conclude, realism is somewhat constrained. Especially structural realists are somewhat constrained by their origins. The constraints in their origins in terms of their historical period that it was founded tend to be founded in the wake of massive world wars, when military power was the thing that mattered. Theorists tend to grab onto that initial perception, or that initial assumption, and sometimes actually make it tighter as it went on. It has not been empirically successful in really predicting things. It hasn't held up to its own claims. And the way ahead is definitely neoclassical realism, which has a wider view of the sources of international order and a deeper look at human nature.